Welcome to How to Get on a Watchlist, the new podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading experts to discuss dangerous activities. From assassinations and airliner shootdowns through to kidnappings and coups, we'll examine each of these threats through the lenses of both the dangerous actors seeking to conduct these operations and the agencies around the world seeking to stop them.
In the interest of operational security, certain tactical details will be omitted from these discussions. However, the cases and threats which we discuss here are very real.
I'm Lewis H. Besant, the founder and co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a researcher in the field of intelligence and espionage with a PhD in intelligence studies from Loughborough University. I'm an adjunct professor in intelligence at Sciences Po Paris, and in my day job, I provide geopolitical analysis and security-focused intelligence to private sector corporations.
I'm Alexandra Szukiewicz, a co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a multilingual security and intelligence professional with a master's in international security from Sciences Po Paris. I have served in both consulting and in-house roles focusing on threat monitoring, geopolitical intelligence, and security support to various public and private audiences.
So today we're going to be discussing how to invade a country, and our guest is General Mick Ryan. He's a retired Major General in the Australian Army, a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the US Marine Corps University Command and Staff College and School of Advanced Warfighting. He's commanded at platoon, squadron, regiment, task force and brigade level. General Ryan was made a member of the Order of Australia, AM, for his leadership of Australia's first reconstruction task force in Afghanistan. He completed his 35-year career with the Australian Army and transitioned into the Army Reserve in 2022. He's an adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute. He's also the author of War Transformed, released in 2022, and White Sun War, released in 2023, with a book on Ukraine coming out in 2024. So, General, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So our first question that we like to ask our guests is, you've had an absolutely fascinating career. How did you get into your line of work?
Well, my first one, which was being in the Army, I got into straight from school. I'd been wanting to be a soldier for most of my life. The only thing I ever wanted to be other than that was an archaeologist. It was after seeing Indiana Jones. But I decided to join the Army and became a combat engineer and spent 35 years, 1 month and 12 days doing that, spending a lot of time in lots of hot, sandy places and hot, wet places around the world. And, after reaching the rank of Major General, I decided, I was interested in doing something else. Still loved the military and decided the best time to leave was when you still love it. And that's what I did 18 months ago.
And so today's topic, we're going to talk about, how to invade a country. So I suppose the big question is, we've seen some pretty spectacular examples of this exact challenge in the last year or so. So when thinking about invading a country, this is a huge operation. There's a lot of moving parts. What are the sorts of things a leader should be thinking about in advance?
Clearly, we're thinking at this from the red perspective here. Caveat is I'm not thinking about doing this myself personally, but, if I was to put myself in the red team's shoes, first and foremost, you think about, what's the political objective here? What are you trying to achieve? And actually, can you do it without having to use military force? Most times, not every time, but a lot of times, military force is the last option because this is a pretty serious commitment of time, of people, of resources, and it very rarely goes according to plan, almost never goes according to plan. So first and foremost is what's the political objective here? And secondly, can I do this any other way other than having to conduct a large-scale military operation? So, I think they're the two main considerations. And then I guess the third one is, do I have the military means to achieve the political outcomes I'm after? And, I think as we've seen in Ukraine, the Russians did not have the military means to achieve the political outcomes. They wanted to take over all of Ukraine. They had the military means to do far, far short of that. So the alignment of military, as well as diplomacy and economic and all those things, with the high-level political objectives is pretty important to think about as well.
And once the mind is actually set on conducting an invasion, what's the timeline for planning such an operation? And what are also the key factors then that you would have influencing how much time should actually be budgeted for this?
As much as possible. If you have a look back through history, D-Day is a great example of an invasion. They spent years talking about it, a couple of years planning in great detail, at least a year training and stockpiling. This is a pretty significant undertaking and it takes a long time. The Chinese have been planning to invade Taiwan since 1949. So somewhere between 1 year and 70 years is probably the answer. What the right one is will just depend on the country, the one that's undertaking the operation, the operational culture of both militaries involved, how many resources you got, and what the political objectives are. But normally a couple of weeks won't cut it.
What about notifying your troops? There was some reporting that some Russian troops were only told they were invading as late as, a few hours before departure, including some of the junior officers. What sort of effect can this have? How really should that be done, gearing your army up psychologically for an invasion?
Yeah, the obvious answer is not like that. A large number of Russians, allegedly, did not know they were there to invade Ukraine until the last minute. And when they were told, they were told, well, yeah, okay, you're invading Ukraine, but it's only going to take 10 days. It's a road march to Kyiv. The government will fall. They're not really going to fight hard. The West isn't really going to intervene. You should be right, and, you'll probably be occupying for a little while, and then you'll be home in time for Christmas. None of that worked out for them. You need to be honest with all levels of your military about the challenges. You need to be honest with them about the political objectives, so you can line military and political things for the war. And I think if you contrast what the Russians did, which was basically tell almost no one, to what the PLA is doing, which is telling everyone it's going to do this, and every Chinese soldier knows that's exactly what they're going to do at some point. I think the Chinese method is probably, if you're in the enemy's shoes, a better method.
And then when we think about kind of the idea of strategic surprise, it's something that's so crucial to military encounters. And in the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine, we saw a lot made of troop build-ups and was this an exercise? Was this really going to be an invasion? And, this is a country right next door over a land border. So it's a pretty simple endeavor by comparison to, say, an invasion of Taiwan. Is that sort of strategic surprise even possible in this day and age, in the age of satellites, advanced surveillance, especially when you're looking at a kind of overseas invasion? And if so, what could you do to mitigate this lack of surprise if you are planning an invasion?
Yeah, I think it's still possible. Notwithstanding the very pervasive sensor network that covers the world now, both military and civilian, it's a mesh network. Just because you can see everything doesn't mean you know everything. Seeing a lot of things doesn't make you wise about what you're seeing. And I think the lead up to Ukraine was a great example of that. I think several European governments had convinced themselves that there's no way the Russians would do this. And I think, there's examples of that from before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, and a range of other events historically where people, despite all the evidence, convinced themselves that no rational actor would undertake this operation, and then they go ahead and do it. In some respects, the Americans before the Second World War thought there's no way the Japanese will go to war with us, they'll lose. And the Japanese went, we really don't want to go to war with the Americans because we know we'll lose, but they did anyway. So, rationality is an important part of this, but it's still possible to surprise people. And if we have a look at, the situation in Ukraine where there's a land border, very long land border, I think surprise is still possible. And in somewhere like Taiwan, where you've got 180 kilometres of open sea between them, if you're doing large-scale exercises regularly and you normalise that, well, that's one way you might be able to achieve surprise as well. But, it is harder, but surprise is an enduring part of warfare. We have seen surprise throughout this war in Ukraine. I mean, from the Kerch Bridge attacks to attacks on Moscow to the Kharkiv offensives, surprise is just going to continue to happen regardless of how well surveilled the battlefield is. I mean, we served in Afghanistan, which until that time, or at least until Ukraine, was probably the most densely surveilled piece of earth in the history of warfare, and we were still surprised all the time. So seeing everything doesn't mean you know everything.
And just linking back to that, so one of the surprises, I guess, that we also saw in Ukraine was kind of issues with supply chains. There were so many reports about challenges in getting sufficient ammunition to the front. How crucial are supply chains actually in conducting warfare successfully?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the surprise was that people were surprised by that. I mean, this isn't exactly a new lesson. Ever since Rorke's Drift, we've known that you need to get a lot of stuff to a lot of soldiers very quickly, otherwise you don't win. And the fact that we'd forgotten that since the end of the Cold War and we lulled into a sense of security in these very slow-moving counterinsurgency campaigns we'd taken, I mean, we've just forgotten hard-learned lessons from the last 150 years or so. But at the end of the day, real strategy takes into account logistics and critical items. I mean, if you have a look at the Second World War in Europe and the Mediterranean, the pacing piece of equipment was LSTs, landing ship tanks, not combat divisions, not Air Force squadrons, not bombers. It was where are the LSTs and how many of them are there? And that was the thing that drove where and when amphibious operations took place. So, that's just one example of the importance of logistics. But, I think Ukraine has shown that the level of stockpiling as well as the level of productive capacity in the West is well short of what's needed, not just to fight a war, but to deter those who might like to engage in a war against us. I mean, I think your industrial capacity is part of a conventional deterrent that says to people, listen, we can outproduce you. Don't try this on. And we've forgotten that. I think we're relearning it through the blood of the Ukrainians, and hopefully we take the right lessons from it.
So I'm going to offer a very minor spoiler to White Sun War here. So if you haven't yet read the book, I'd suggest you mute me quickly. But in the book, one theme that you do touch on is supply chains being interfered with by insurgents, by kind of behind the front lines partisans. So how do occupying forces, especially when they're still in that kind of push phase, trying to seize and hold territory, how do they deal with partisan activities behind the front lines? Is there a tried and tested method for successfully doing this?
Have lots of rear area troops. Partisans attacking supply lines goes all the way back to, Alexander's time, right? He never moved on until he'd formed a whole new logistics supply base in his move towards India. And good commanders ever since have understood that you've got to secure backwards as well as forward when you're undertaking a military campaign. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to do what the Marines call single battle. You need to do a deep fight, which is well in advance. You need close combat, and then you have a rear battle, which isn't just logistics, but it's securing your rear areas and ensuring neither the enemy or civilians can't do things to interfere, not just with supply lines, but supply points, headquarters, transportation nodes, and these kinds. At the end of the day, it's a numbers game, and you need people on the ground that can do that. And unless we invent a whole range of clever autonomous systems that can do it in the future, and that, it's within the realms of possibility. In fact, I was at University of Queensland today looking at some amazing robotic systems, but we're not there yet. So the way you solve this is throwing people at it.
General Ryan, in White Sun War, you place emphasis on timing regarding China's decision to invade Taiwan, and notably exploiting distractions in the US. What else factors into timing an invasion? Some have also theorized that China's invasion of Taiwan would happen at China's economic peak. Does that seem reasonable to you?
Well, I mean, politics clearly drives timing, not just the politics of your adversary, but your own, whether you're popular or not, whether you need something to focus people externally rather than internally. I think Chinese economy is a really interesting question. There's so many different views on this, but I think there is consensus that the Chinese economy is doing poorly at the moment. And distracting people from that could be a reason why the CCP do something catastrophic. But, you also need to look at things like weather and terrain and geography drive these things. I mean, I did a lot of research on typhoon season, for example, for White Sun War. I mean, there's bits of the year you just can't do military operations in the Western Pacific because of the cyclone season or heavy rains, or you can't do large-scale ones. So these things all have an impact. So, there's a whole lot of layers when it comes to timing and locations, which drives the initial question you asked me about how long in advance should you be looking at things. I mean, you just can't turn these things on. It takes a lot of planning over months or years. And even if you wanted to do something quickly, if you're in the middle of typhoon season, it's just not physically possible to do some of these things, either because you can't move across the ocean or you can't undertake cross-country mobility because it's mud, just like we see in Ukraine, of course. So all these things kind of play into it. There's the political, geography, weather, all these kind of things.
So you talked about the importance of things like having landing ships positioned in the right place. What about training and experience? Prior to D-Day, the Allies had conducted numerous landings across the Pacific and European theatres. Would you expect China to attempt, smaller scale operations on perhaps Taiwan's outlying islands to try and give them the experience ahead of any attempt on the main island?
I mean, possibly they would, but you've got to ask, well, why would they do that? Because it's basically invading Taiwan, even if it's, I was on Kinmen Island in April, which is just a couple of kilometres offshore from mainland China. And you could do that, but that's pretty much a declaration of war. You could then kind of surmise, well, would the West want to intervene over that? I mean, Eisenhower didn't. He was very clear, I'm not going to war over some rocks. But that's a very small-scale problem compared to Taiwan. And, the Chinese have really only been doing joint operations for less than a decade. They only established their theatre commands in the east, the south, the west, the north, northeast. From about 2015 onwards, it's been a priority of Xi. That's a very, very short time. In the West, we've been doing it for decades, and it's still really hard for a range of cultural and other reasons. So, we shouldn't expect the Chinese will get this right the first or even the second or third time. And the larger the scale of joint operations, it increases the degree of difficulty significantly, not just by a little bit, it's, orders of magnitude. So, they've got a lot to learn, but they are doing a lot of exercising. I track a lot of the stuff they're doing. They are doing constant exercises, single service as well as joint, to hone their ability to do integrated operations whilst also breaking down enemy integrated operations at the same time.
I suppose that leads one final question before we start thinking about kind of the defense and the Blue Force side of this, which is, I see a lot of criticisms against the relatively mediocre performance of the Russian military in Ukraine. And I wonder, is that leading us to a sense of complacency over the PLA? How do you feel qualitatively the Chinese military is in terms of both troops and equipment, and how well would you expect them to perform in a similar operation?
You can never predict this, is the short answer. I don't think we can rest on our laurels and assume the PLA is the same as the Russians. They've certainly studied the Russians, but they've also studied us. They've certainly studied the Americans for a very long time. I think they have invested more in individual training and collective training compared to the Russians. But at the same time, they do also have a very highly centralised command and control approach. So I think the Chinese have looked at Russia and gone, we'd just do that better. I don't know we could assert that with any certainty, but prudence dictates we assume the Chinese would be much better than the Russians. I mean, if we assume that they'd be the same or worse, I think that would be dangerous and would probably lead us to bad places. So if nothing else, prudence dictates you've got to assume that they could do it much better than the Russians could. And to be quite honest, it probably wouldn't be hard to do things better than the Russians could.
You have been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist, the podcast series from Encyclopaedia Geopolitica. If you like this show, don't forget to check out our other content at Encyclopaedia Geopolitica, which you can find at howtogetonawatchlist.com, where you can find our analysis on various geopolitical issues, as well as reading lists covering topics like those discussed in the podcast. Please also consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice, giving us a rating, and joining our Patreon.
And now looking at an invasion from a different angle, from the defending forces angle, what should you be thinking about when defending against an invasion, and what are the different elements you have to keep in mind?
First and foremost, you want to invest in deterring anything like that happening, right? You want to build up your intelligence, your diplomacy, your military, and a whole range of things to deter it to the degree possible. And if it does happen, to shape it into the kind of fight that you want to fight. I've studied Taiwan for a while on this, and, for 60, 70 years, they prepared for a conventional fight against the Chinese. That's just not going to work now because China's a different country than what it was in 1950. So you had Admiral Lee Tse-min in 2017 with the overall defence concept, and a very different and asymmetric approach to Taiwanese defence. And they're the kind of intellectual undertakings you need to look at. You need to have a good assessment of who's likely to present a threat, what kind of threats, and what's your ability to deter or to fight off that threat if it actually manifests. Another piece is looking beyond your own capability is alliances. I mean, one thing that we're very, very fortunate to have is alliances with the Americans, whether it's through NATO or in our part of the world, ANZUS, or, the Japanese have an alliance, Filipinos have an alliance. It's always better to fight with friends rather than fight alone. And, there's, once again, thousands of years of history to provide evidence along those lines. Chinese don't have any friends that are going to fight alongside them, so they've probably got an issue there. They can probably only pull off one thing at a time because of that. So, you've got to think through who's the most likely enemy, how are you going to fight, what's your alliance framework. And then, you need to think about, well, what's your indigenous production capability? What's your indigenous mobilisation capacity, not just with industry, but with people, with mobilising influence operations, these kind of things. I mean, I think Ukraine stands out as a singular example where one person has made such a profound difference that the war would have been different without that person. That's Zelensky, right? I mean, his leadership in unifying his country and soliciting aid from NATO and beyond has made the difference. So you want to make sure you've got one of them. And, I call it the Zelensky test. I think there's a lot of politicians who look in the mirror, probably not now, but certainly in the first few weeks of the war, thinking, would I pass the Zelensky test? And sadly, I think for many of our politicians, the answer would be no. But you need people who can lead, people who will take risks, people who will take the hard decisions in the national security enterprise, not just in the military, just as the Ukrainians have done. So that's kind of a long answer of what you've got to do to kind of deter or fight it, but you need all those things. And the final one is will, national will, whether it's the will of the government, the ability of the government to unify national will. I mean, if you go to Ukraine, you see the people there have will. They know what they're up against. They know through Bucha and Irpin and places like this is an existential fight, and they're able to harness will to resist the Russians for, I think, as long as they need to.
And you talked about the importance of intelligence. What are the different signals that you would be watching out for to make sure that you can actually detect a potential invasion early on?
There's a lot of indicators and warnings, right? And, there's simple ones that, massing of transportation, whether it's aerial or ground or ships. Stockpiling logistics, another simple one. Stockpiling artillery ammunition and these kind of things. Massing of combat forces. I mean, these are all basic ones. There's some other ones that aren't as obvious. I mean, things like quiet call-ups of reservists. Not all of them, but important ones. Stockpiling of blood products is a really interesting combat indicator. stockpiling of things like raw materials used in national industries that might be subject to sanctions might be an indicator and warning, and that was certainly one in White Sun War. So certainly there's some pretty obvious ones, but there's some not so obvious ones that if you have a pretty robust indicator and warnings framework, and I'm pretty certain the Americans at Indo-PACOM have a pretty long and extensive indicators and warning program that looks at across the breadth of Chinese society to see is something changing in both the will and the capacity of the CCP to do something precipitous.
Staying on the subject of intelligence, you talk about this a bit in White Sun War. You know, the Chinese forces being shocked that they're facing resistance from Taiwanese civilians. It's something we've seen with Russian forces being similarly surprised, especially in the early days of the invasion of Ukraine. Does this say something about the danger of a kind of political officer system that we see in authoritarian militaries and their intelligence services? Is there something that we can learn and exploit there?
Yeah, I mean, we saw this not just at the beginning of 2022 in Ukraine, but we saw it in 2014 as well. I mean, if you have a look at some of the lessons study of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, their intelligence services made exactly the same errors about they'll be welcome as liberators, all these kind of things. And when you tell your soldiers that, and it doesn't happen, you know, it results in a form of psychological shock. They question why they were there. It can result in atrocities because they take it out on the local people, these kind of things, which we've seen consistently and systemically from the Russians. And we're probably likely to see it from the Chinese in Taiwan. They're told in China that Taiwan is part of China. It is a rebellious province. And we know what the Chinese do to rebellious provinces, right? You know, look at how they've treated Tibet or Xinjiang or Hong Kong, to be quite frank. And I don't think Taiwan could expect anything less. And you know, I was there in April talking to their National Security Council and Foreign Minister. They don't expect to be treated very kindly if the Chinese ever seek to take Taiwan back. Taiwan will not look like anything like it does right now. If you go to Taipei, you know, I felt like I was just in another European city, except, you know, it was a Chinese variant of that. Vibrant, people could say what they want, do what they wanted. That would disappear. And so, you know, this all gets into can cause shock to an invading force when they see this because they're just not used to it.
So having spoken a lot about kind of the insurgency side of civil resistance, if you're not willing to take up arms, you're not able to take up arms, but you are a civilian that finds themselves caught up in an invasion, what can you do? What can the civilian population do to help with national defence?
There's a few things. You know, I'll go back to the overall defence concept for Taiwan. I mean, one of them is just national resilience, which is things like having a reserve force that can either supplement the military or act as a resistance force if there is an actual invasion. But just preparing people for disinformation, misinformation from the enemy. We're seeing in places like Sweden now that they're doing more to prepare people prior to and during warfare for enemy propaganda and misinformation. It's not something that a lot of countries in the West have done since the end of the Cold War, and it's a game we need to get back into because it's something that's being practiced against us every day, 24/7 by, you know, the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans and other malign actors. So that intellectual hardening of a populace is really important. I think convincing the population that things like national service are important and the kinds of national service are undertaken are important. I mean, national service doesn't just have to be military. It can be a whole array of different things. Could be ambulance drivers, could be, I don't know, people responding to bushfires in civil defence things. So these are all, I think, important areas where governments can influence populations in the lead up to major confrontations. And then during, as we've seen in Ukraine, we've seen primarily provision of intelligence by people who were stuck in occupied Russia. So I think, you know, a lot of the targeting we see of large Russian supply dumps or transportation hubs, these kind of things, it would not surprise me if at least some of the intelligence for that is provided by local people in those occupied areas. So, you see all that kind of thing. And, the Russian response has been to deport people to Russia and to kidnap children. I mean, that's what Putin will be brought up to the ICC about, is that kidnapping of children, among other things, eventually, hopefully. So there's an array of things that people can do beyond just joining the reserve or the resistance when it comes to these kind of situations.
And now, having looked a bit at the different things that a country can actually do to defend itself, what would be the worst case scenario when defending against an invasion?
I think the use of weapons of mass destruction is kind of the worst case for a couple of reasons. I mean, clearly there's the moral and humanitarian impact are profound. We haven't seen this on a large scale since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and I think the damage of a nuclear weapon would be really significant. The damage of a biological weapon would probably be orders of magnitude worse. When we've seen, COVID was a recent experience with that. Not only is it a humanitarian and moral catastrophe, it is probably more likely to influence political decisions of the country it's used against as well. So, that is the worst case, the use of weapons of mass destruction. Because if you use these things, the impact of them is lingering for a very long time, for generations in some cases, but certainly for many, many years afterward.
And a moment ago, you touched on propaganda and disinformation. One of the most successful actions by Ukraine, especially in those early days of the war, seems to be in the information warfare domain. It's been described as them conducting a terrific meme war. What do you see as the purpose of this kind of activity from a defensive side, and what sort of benefits can that bring you?
Well, I think there's a couple of purposes. The most important one actually isn't to influence the West, it's to maintain internal unity in Ukraine. There's lots of different bits of Ukraine. It's split east-west in some views, it's split ethnically, it has different language regions. But the war appears to have unified people. And, I have spoken to quite a few Ukrainians since the war. A lot of them who spoke Russian on 21 February had automatically just shifted to Ukrainian, both spoken, text, all this kind of thing. So I think internal cohesion of the nation has been the most important element of Ukrainian information activities. But clearly the secondary one has been external support, and whether that is for military assistance, diplomatic assistance, help getting sanctions against the Russians, humanitarian assistance, taking in Ukrainian refugees. I remember, at the start of the war, about 8 million Ukrainians became displaced. Not all of them left Ukraine, but 8 million were displaced. About half of those have since returned, but there's still 4 million Ukrainians who are displaced from their homes, either in Ukraine or in Europe. So all these things are really important objectives of Ukrainian information operations. And, it's something that they have to evolve, that they have to think about constantly, that they need to target at different countries slightly differently, and accept that they're not going to get cut through in every country, and that the Russians who are focused on South America, Africa, South Asia are doing far better in those areas than Ukraine is. Now, that doesn't mean Ukraine has written them off. Clearly it hasn't. I mean, with the president and the participation in the peace conference in Saudi Arabia is about saying to South Asia, we'd like you to hear our side of the story as well. But at the end of the day, the Ukrainians have been tremendously effective, and they've been able to kind of build a coalition of online warriors, hacktivists, the NAFO movement, bonking Vatniks and all this kind of stuff, addressing Russian misinformation online, that I think is really unprecedented. There's no real precedent for what the Ukrainians have been able to achieve in this war.
And you mentioned the importance of alliances earlier. Many defending countries will need to keep their allied support on side, make sure everyone's happy. What's the impact of that, and how can that constrain their counterattacks or even strategy?
Yeah, I mean, alliances always place some constraint on you, whether it is how you work, where you conduct operations, the level of resourcing you have, the need for you to commit to their defence as well as your own. So alliances are always going to have that impact. I mean, Churchill, I think, had some pretty choice quotes on working with allies. But at the end of the day, it's always a better way of working. We forget in World War II that the US and Soviet Union were allies, and was the provision of British and American assistance in the first 2 years of the war that kept the Soviet Union in the war. They would not have been able to fight back if it hadn't been for that Lend-Lease program, to be honest. You'll never hear that from Putin. So alliances are vital, and you have to pay a lot of attention to nurturing the relationships within alliances while seeking to break down the alliance frameworks of your adversary. I mean, it's not just about you. You want to break down your enemy's alliance systems as well. And there's a lot of ways you can, nurture your own while destroying the enemy. There's the famous story of Eisenhower when he was the US commander for US forces in Britain before he became, SACEUR and all this kind of thing. He sent home an American officer who'd had a fight with a British officer. And the American was really confused. He said, "What, you're sending me home for calling him an SOB?" And he said, "No, I'm sending you home for calling him a British SOB." So, Eisenhower could tolerate professional tension and allowed it, and you kind of have to if you want good solutions. He couldn't tolerate this kind of nationalistic bile in between two very, very important alliance partners.
And when it comes to fighting back, so going from a defensive posture to counteroffensive, what are the essential ingredients to make sure that you have a successful counteroffensive, and how do you make sure that you can time it right?
Yeah, I mean, timing in particular is pretty important, right? I mean, politics is very important. Counteroffensives might be military activities, but they have political objectives. So political timing is vital. And we've seen that in the lead up to and during the conduct of this counteroffensive. I mean, the timing is also reliant on how much can you build up supplies. I mean, offensive operations go through far more consumables, whether it's fuel, water, ammunition, these kind of things, than defensive operations do. So you've got to stockpile a huge amount, and you've got to do it in the right places. At the same time, you have to make sure there's time to train your forces. Training people on tanks is very different to training a tank battalion or training a combined arms brigade. I mean, collective training of military forces is very hard. I commanded a combined arms brigade, and that's all we do, 365 days a year, and it's still really hard. When you're a brand new soldier in a brand new brigade and all you've done is trained on your vehicle or your weapon and then being asked to undertake combined arms operations, it's extraordinarily difficult. So that individual and collective training is vital. Another thing that drives timing is just the planning and wargaming of the best options. Where should the main effort be? Your terrain analysis. Where do you weight your forces? How much surprise do you want to achieve? How much confusion do you want to sow in the enemy's command and control? How many feints and demonstrations do you want to do versus actual real-time operations? So all these things really take a lot of time to think through and plan, as we saw in the lead-up to this operation. But at some point, you've got to do it. And you're never going to be able to launch a counteroffensive at the perfect time. It's always going to be a kind of compromise between politics, military readiness, and, of course, the enemy's capacity, because they get a vote. So you've got to think about them all the way through this planning process as well.
Well, General Ryan, our final question we like to leave guests with is when thinking about national defence and security, what is it that keeps you up at night? What is it that really worries you?
I guess the one thing is, what haven't we thought of? What are those things that will really surprise us that we may not be able to recover from? I mean, strategic surprise in previous years, for a range of reasons, whether it's geography or resources or whatever, you had time to kind of recover. If you have a look at the fall of Singapore or the fall of France, the Allies had time to recover and then go back on the offensive. Now, the people of France probably didn't appreciate that, and all the people of occupied countries. But I don't know whether we have that time in the current era. I don't know if there's a massive surprise strike against Taiwan and US forces in the Pacific, whether we might have time to respond. and fight through the shock. So if there's anything that, keeps me up at night is, do we get the ability to recover and respond in modern war? And I don't have a good answer for that one.
Well, General Mick Ryan, thank you very much for joining us.
No, thanks. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate the time to talk.
You've been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist. Our guest for this episode was General Mick Ryan. A link to his latest book, White Sun War, can be found in the show notes for this episode. Our producer for this episode was Edwin Tran, and our researcher was Alex Smith. Thank you very much for listening.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider checking out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica. We'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, or support us on Patreon. Thanks for listening.